The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Natural disasters, human-made calamities, and a combination of the two. Our species has seen them all, but have we learned from them? Tonight, historian Niall Ferguson reflects on that and his new book, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe. First up, J.N. Jagannathan finds out about the threat of heat waves that even here in our northern climes seem to be more deadly every year. It's Thursday, June 30th, and that's next on The Agenda.
Last summer, hundreds of people in this country died as a result of heat waves, and already heat warnings have been issued in many parts of British Columbia and Ontario. What's going on, and if this is happening in our notoriously cold climate, what's happening elsewhere? Let's ask. In Mumbai, India, Arpita Mondal, Associate Professor in Civil Engineering and the Interdisciplinary Program in Climate Studies at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. In Barcelona, Spain, Rachel White, Assistant Professor of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of British Columbia's Department of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. And here in our studio, Blair Feltmate, Head of the University of Waterloo's Intact Center on Climate Adaptation. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so to sort of set up the discussion, I want to set the table. The United Nations World Meteorological Organization has called heat waves the world's deadliest meteorological hazard, impacting every single continent. This year, India experienced its hottest March in more than 120 years. Last summer, in British Columbia, extreme heat killed nearly 600 people. It was the deadliest weather event in Canadian history. In the village of Lytton, residents were exposed to a new Canadian heat record of 49.6 degrees Celsius. That's halfway to the boiling point of water. The town was later hit by wildfire soon after that displaced 1,200 people. Of all climate change-related weather events in this country, extreme heat is the leading cause of death. Blair, I'm going to come to you first. In comparing heat waves to floods and wildfires, your team is now calling heat waves the silent killer. How come?
Because when things go wrong due to climate change and extreme weather risk, and it's generally speaking flooding, wildfires, and extreme heat, when things go wrong relative to flooding and wildfires, it's very financially expensive. It's costly. But generally speaking, nobody dies. It's 0, 1, 2, 3, perhaps maybe 4 people die in floods or fires, which of course, not to be indelicate, is 4 people too many. But when things go wrong relative to extreme heat, that's when people can die, in the hundreds and even potentially into the thousands. And as you referenced, we had 619 people die prematurely in British Columbia last summer. In 2018 in Quebec, we had 86 people died prematurely. But in both of those cases, those people died under what is you might term good conditions. And again, not to be indelicate, but the electricity was running. Had the electricity gone out during those heat waves and fans and air conditionings weren't running, those deaths would have popped into the high hundreds, if not thousands.
All right, Arpita, I wanted to get your take on that. What do you think about when we talk about heat waves being a silent killer?
Yeah, I very much agree to that statement. In India, heat waves are not even recognized as a significant natural disaster as per our National Disaster Management Act. So although we see in the recent years, more and more of these events show up, particularly the post-2000s, that's the period where a lot of heat wave events have happened in India. But, their features keep changing. And although India is not a stranger to heat waves, they happen pretty frequently in this part of the world. But their features keep changing, like for this year, for example, this year it happened much earlier than its regular period of occurrence. And it was also far more widespread. And it also led to more significant impacts and even, threatening food security of the country. So it's quite significant that way.
All right, we'll get into that a little later. I want to actually take a look at what parts in this country, both smaller cities and smaller communities and larger cities should be most concerned about heat waves in the future. This is from your recent report, Blair. We're going to go from west to east. In BC, low-lying areas from the west coast to the Rockies. As we travel east in the prairies bordering the U.S., we're talking about cities like Regina and Winnipeg, and closer to home here in Ontario, north of Lake Erie through the St. Lawrence River Valley, we're talking about cities like Windsor, Hamilton, Niagara, Ottawa, and Montreal. Rachel, we think of ourselves as a frigid northern country, but it turns out Canada is quite vulnerable to extreme heat. Why are we susceptible to heat waves?
Well, I think part of it is because we're not used to this level of heat. As you say, we think of ourselves as a colder country. And so as the climate is warming up due to human activities, that sort of extreme heat is edging its way into these colder climates. And we're not used to that. We don't necessarily have the infrastructure to cope with these extreme heat events. And that can cause, as we've seen, devastation and devastating impacts.
All right, I want to pull up another graph. This is a graph that shows how extreme heat is on the rise in Canadian cities and towns. The yellow bar shows the average number of very hot days per year communities have typically had from 1976 to 2005. And what constitutes a very hot day in this example is 30 degrees Celsius or higher. The red bar to the right is a forecast of the number of very hot days residents could suffer through if greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase at current rates to the end of this century. So we're looking similar cities that we saw in Ontario, Windsor, Hamilton, Niagara. Look at Windsor, for example, in the yellow when we talk about very hot days in 1976 to 2005, we're looking at about just over 20. But when we look at from 2051 to 2080, we're nearing 80. Blair, I want to come to you. We can see from the graphs that cities are even more at risk of extreme heat. It's due to something called the urban heat island effect. How does that work?
Yeah, just the physicality of cities themselves. They add to the heat wave that would be there independent of the city being there. And we have things in cities, for example, that contribute to heat. For example, anybody who's flown into any one of these cities, when you look down on the rooftops of factories and shopping malls and apartment buildings, for example, almost universally everything is dark. It's black tar. When sunlight hits that dark surface, only a very small amount of that energy reflects back up into space. Most of the energy stays in the system and contributes to heating in the city. But if we were to paint these roofs white, literally put a white surface on them, when the sunlight hits that surface, about 80% of the energy will reflect back up into space and only a smaller amount stay in the system. So relatively speaking, we can be cooler than if we weren't to engage this activity. So there's a number of activities like that within cities we can engage to at least minimize the heat island effect.
Do we have a sense of how sort of the difference in surface temperature when we're talking about a rural area to an urban area?
As a rule of thumb, it's about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius warmer in cities as a result of the heat island effect at the surface level where people would be walking around.
Pretty significant. Now, curious, what sorts of people are most vulnerable to the deadly effects of heat waves?
Yeah, so there's 3 primary groups in the country that are particularly vulnerable to extreme heat. Number 1 is the elderly, and these are people greater than 70 years of age, generally speaking, living on their own, perhaps in the back of a rooming house somewhere. So we need to keep track of where are those people. We need to know where they are and check on them during heat waves to make sure they're hydrated. Do they have an air conditioner? Do they have a fan? That's the first group. Second group are the homeless. We need roving teams in cities during heat waves to check on the homeless to say, do they know where the cooling center is? Do they need a drive to a cooling center? Are they hydrated? And then the third group are people with pre-existing health conditions, generally speaking respiratory in nature. We need to have heat alerts go out to give them time to put themselves in a situation where they're not in harm's way when the heat event hits. So those are the 3 primary groups.
All right, Rachel, I want to come to you. I want to get a sense of what this extreme heat does to humans and our human body. There is something called the wet bulb temperature factor, and the wet bulb temperature. And I want to get a sort of a layman terms explanation of how this works. It's quite phenomenal when you think about it, but I don't think a lot of people understand that your body needs to breathe.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's not actually just temperatures in these extreme heat events that matter. It's temperatures and humidity. And so that's what this wet bulb temperature essentially combines, is the temperature of the air and the humidity of the air. And the reason that's important is that humans cool down, and we cool down by sweating, and then that sweat evaporates from our skin. And it's that evaporation that takes energy away from our skin and puts it into the gas. The liquid is no longer liquid, it's now a gas. And that actually cools down our skin and the air very close to our skin. But if the air is really humid, many of us have experienced this. When you sort of have a very humid day, you feel sticky. You don't actually evaporate that sweat from your body. It's just sort of dripping off you sometimes. And that's not helping us cool down. That's just making us feel sticky and unpleasant. And so that's why the humidity of the air matters. If air is drier, more evaporation can take place from our bodies. We're able to keep ourselves cool with that sort of human mechanism. But when the air is hot and humid, essentially that sweat doesn't evaporate, and so we can't cool ourselves down. And at a certain wet bulb temperature, essentially our bodies can no longer cool themselves, and we can just overheat and sort of almost cook from the inside.
Is it deadly in that sense? Like, how does that get us to sort of organ failures when we look at Lytton, BC, where in British Columbia, where 600 people died? What was the case there?
Yeah, so it certainly can be deadly. And so essentially, wet bulb temperatures of more than around 35 Celsius can be deadly for humans in about 6 hours if we don't have another way to cool down. Like, even if we have water, if we don't have a way to cool ourselves, then that can be deadly. And it often is, as we've seen in so many of these devastating heat events.
Arpita, India is one of the countries most affected by extreme heat. You gave us a little taste of sort of what's been happening at the top. We had mentioned that you had suffered through the hottest March on record. I'm hoping you can give us a sense of how the impacts on daily life have been so far in your area.
Yeah, so this year's heat wave was pretty unique in the sense that, unlike the previous years where it had occurred in the months of May and June, which are typically known to be prone to heat waves, this year, March and April were really, really hot. And, there are coastal cities where a combination of heat and humidity, as Rachel was explaining, play a big role in human health and morbidity and mortality. So what had happened also was that a large part of the country, so unlike the heat wave pockets, we had about 70% of the country reeling under the heat wave in March and April. And that time of the year is also the time of, it's the growing season of the crop wheat, which is the second most important staple crop in India. So what happened was that because wheat is also a crop which is highly sensitive to temperature changes, a lot of wheat productivity was affected adversely because of the heat wave. And India had initial plans of supplementing global food supplies, particularly considering the Ukraine crisis in mind. But then the country was forced to stop all the export of wheat. And other than the vulnerable populations and communities which Blair was mentioning, in India, we also have a lot of daily wage workers. So these are laborers who work on a daily wage basis. And if they don't show up for the work, they won't get paid. A large part of our labor force is actually daily wage workers. So their working hours were affected. And of course, in India, a lot of the reporting also is underestimated. And heat waves related death is also very hard to report in the sense that, somebody with a pre-existing condition might actually die of a heart attack. In that case, it will not be recorded as a heat wave related mortality. So these are all some of the challenges which face our country when it comes to heat waves.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I've heard stories that it's so hot right now in India that you could literally cook an egg in your house without using a stovetop or anything like that.
That That is unfortunately true. And, not from this year, but I've seen videos in YouTube from previous years where in a southern state of Telangana, there's a woman who puts an egg on her floor and it gets fried. It's literally that hot. I am from Mumbai where, it might be actually 35 degrees Celsius, but it feels like a 42 because of the humidity. So that also comes into play.
Very interesting. Blair, I'm going to come to you. So 500,000 Torontonians live in old apartment buildings higher than 8 stories, nearly all of which lack central air conditioning. Many also lack backup power generation. You've called this a disaster in the making. Why?
Yeah, it is a disaster in the making. So if we get an extreme heat event combined with an electricity outage, and there's only backup power generation to run elevators for maybe 2 or 3 hours, and that's it, you can have people on, particularly above the 6th or 7th floor in a building, without access to air conditioning or fans running. But also, I mentioned 6th or 7th floor because just under normal city water pressure, water won't go above the 6th or 7th floor in an apartment building if the pumps go out, if the electricity goes out. So you could have perhaps an elderly couple on the 16th floor in a building somewhere with no air conditioning, no fan, no water, and elevators not running. So this is a deadly combination of factors.
All right, Rachel, I want to come to you when we talk about sort of heat waves in the conversation of climate change. How much can we honestly say climate change is responsible for this global rise in heat waves?
So how much climate change is contributing to any particular heat wave is a complicated question, and scientists work very hard to sort of work out by how much did climate change increase the probability and the intensity of this event. But overall, we can say that mean temperatures are rising. We know that. They're rising because of the increase in greenhouse gases. We know that. And that increase in temperature is going to lead to an increase in heat waves. And so we know for a fact that this is being caused by human activity and the greenhouse gases we're putting into our atmosphere. For any particular event, it is more complicated. But yes, this global rise we're looking into is being caused by us.
Is there a connection, Rachel, to heat waves and other dangerous events like wildfires and floods?
Yes, there is. And so interestingly, during the BC heat wave last year in June, we know you spoke earlier about the wildfire in Lytton, but actually that heat wave was sort of the precursor to a very bad wildfire season across British Columbia. And part of that is that heat really just evaporated a lot of the moisture from the vegetation, from the ground. And so it just dried everything out and made everything sort of much more likely to catch fire. And so then when we had lightning strikes, there were a lot of lightning strikes that were in fact induced by previously burning wildfires and the meteorology that existed because of those fires. We then sort of led to more and more wildfires being ignited on a land that was incredibly dry. We also saw flooding and record stream flows, and so that was related to snowmelt and glaciers melting at very high speeds because of the high temperatures. And so actually, even during the heat wave, there were some evacuation alerts issued within BC for flooding at the same time as we have these record-breaking heat temperatures.
Arpita, it's now been accepted by the United Nations that many of the impacts of global warming are irreversible. We can reduce its effects, but we can't eliminate it. So how much should we be focusing specifically on adapting to these heat waves?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, I always begin the answer to this question by saying that, unless the root cause is addressed, we cannot go too far. So, of course, cutting down emissions is something that has to be done, because if greenhouse gas emissions are continued as they are right now, we are only seeing that this is going to be more frequent and more intense in future. So that's the root cause that has to be addressed. Having said that, there's a huge onus on the federal and state government agencies here in India to recognize heat waves as a potential significant natural disaster and also come up with specific heat action plans. We do see a couple of such examples in Indian cities, which have been, like I can give you an example of the Ahmedabad city, which is in the western part of India, which suffered from a massive heat wave in 2010. Then they came out with their own heat action plan in 2013. And ever since, the city has been fairly successful in dealing with heat waves. Similarly, the city of Mumbai, the city of Surat, these are the first few South Asian cities to come up with their own climate action plans. Concrete measures such as these, both at the federal as well as the state levels, need to be in place. And I also think that the press and media also has a big role, particularly in India, to play on this, because there is not much public awareness. We are a highly populated, highly densely populated country, but there is not much awareness in terms of, people realizing how dangerous it is for them, how long they should stay outdoors if they cannot avoid staying outdoors, how frequently they should hydrate, when should schools be shut, and what sort of modifications can be adopted at their own local household levels. Because remember, we are talking about a population where thousands of people do not even have access to fans, let alone ACs. So a lot of public awareness also is needed in that direction.
Blair, you're doing some very important work. You're working with the Minister of Environment to develop Canada's extreme heat adaptation plan. What sorts of steps? You talked a little bit about some steps that we can take. What steps can we take to adapt?
Yeah, so we're outlining programs that are behavioral in nature. We talked earlier about programs that can be put in place to protect the elderly, the homeless, people with pre-existing health conditions. So that's behavioral adaptation. Mm-hmm. Then within cities, we can engage efforts like, for example, to work to retain and restore tree canopy in the city to provide more shade. We can work with building owners and apartment building owners to put glazing on windows and shutters on windows to keep the heat from entering into an apartment building or condo tower during a heat wave. But probably right at the top of the list is a new transition for the country. We need a heat alert system, almost like an Amber Alert, but for a heat alert, not just in British Columbia, which is now invoking that system, but for provinces right across the country to give everybody a heads up that the heat wave is coming, it's dangerous. Putting it in Amber Alert mode really gets people to pay attention, and that should trigger the whole set of actions to put into action plans to put in place to mitigate the risk.
Rachel, I want to come to you. When we talk about all levels of government, federal, provincial, and municipal, are they taking heat waves seriously enough?
That's a good question. Certainly in BC, in the wake of this heat wave, it is being taken very seriously. And as Blair just mentioned, right, the BC government is doing quite a lot to create this new extreme heat emergency, and what that would entail when that sort of system is started up by a forecast of an extreme alert. But it is one of those things that, unfortunately, until a region experiences it, they often sort of think that, as we were saying earlier, well, maybe we don't need to worry about heat. And I think the heat wave that we had in British Columbia that shattered records, and it was so unprecedented for this region and had these really severe impacts. We know that regions are going to continue to see hotter heat waves and more frequent heat waves as the climate continues to warm. And so really we are sort of urging other jurisdictions, other governments to consider this now. Don't wait until after you've had an event that has killed hundreds, maybe thousands of people. Recognize that climate change is happening and we need to do something about what that means if there was an extreme heat emergency in that local region and how we could mitigate those impacts.
Blair, I found this interesting. Florida's Miami-Dade County now has what they're calling the world's first chief heat officer. Is there anything Canadian governments should be considering that they refuse to?
Yeah, we've actually created in Canada now the equivalent of a chief resiliency officer. So not just for heat, but for floods and fires and so forth. And it's in the form of Bill Blair, Minister for Emergency Preparedness. So he, along with Stephen Guilbeault, the Minister of the Environment, the two of them are doing a very fine job, by the way, that looking at how we could advance, operationalize adaptation in this country to prepare for the events that for sure are coming. And the primary focus is on flooding, fire, and extreme heat. So we're getting there.
What do you think the wake-up call could be for Canadian politicians so that they really start to pay attention here?
Well, adaptation has started to take hold in about the last 2, 3, 4 years with major events going on around the country and across the world to really illustrate that with things going wrong that we have to prepare, and we have to prepare rapidly. But we still, to a certain extent, have a system of management based on disaster. We wait till the disaster occurs and then we hop on it. What I worry about is the fact that there may be an extreme heat event that occurs, that it's not 619 people dying prematurely, but thousands of people dying prematurely due to extreme heat. And that may be the point at which the Canada really turns the corner on this file to really embrace a sense of urgency in reference to preparing for extreme weather events. I hope that doesn't happen, but that may be the case.
I do have to ask a question, a fair question, I think. Your university department is sponsored by the Intact Insurance Company.
Yeah.
Is it fair to say that it's in your department's interest to sort of play up the most serious predictions in heat waves in hopes that people will buy more insurance?
No, not really. The way I look at it is the greater the degree to which we can get the risk out of the system, period, everybody benefits. Homeowners benefit, the insurance company would benefit, municipalities benefit, and provincial and federal governments benefit. Everybody benefits by getting the risk out of the system, and that is the goal, period.
Arpita, I want to come to you. Due to this increase in heat waves, could there be countries in the world that become uninhabitable to humans in the next century?
Yes, that looks like, I mean, it's not a distant, bad dream anymore, because we do have parts of India reaching up to 50 degrees Celsius this year. The national capital of Delhi recorded a 49 degrees Celsius temperature, which are very, very difficult to habitat conditions. There are parts of the Middle East which are also projected to, reach record-breaking temperatures. And we must also realize that heat waves might not always, necessarily be isolated events. They have cascading effects, effects on wildfires and floods, as we saw, but also on droughts in India. And, ours is an agriculture-dependent economy. The rainfall, the monsoon is everything for us. And if you have desiccated soils leading to very dry conditions of the soil, low soil moisture, it's eventually going to affect food security of the country. So the effects are going to be trickled down the economy, and not just that, from the recent stopping of the export of wheat, we also see that this has implications for global food security as well.
Rachel, I want to get your take on this as well. What does this mean when we look at sort of the next century and uninhabitable places in this world?
Yeah, it's scary when we hear reports like that. And I think the thing that I find most important to remember is that often when we look at these predictions for how hot it's going to get, we often look at, well, what if we continue greenhouse gas emissions at the current rate? And what I really want to get across is that we have a choice here. We've already put in a certain amount of warming. There's already going to be more than we have today. Even if we immediately, instantaneously stopped emitting greenhouse gases across the world today, temperatures would continue to rise. And so we really need to act now. We have a pretty small window in which we can act in order to not hit some of these worst case scenarios that we're talking about, that we're hearing about. They are scary, and that's why we need to do something about it now.
Blair?
Well, I think there's a third leg to this stool. And so in reference to dealing with climate change, we need to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. We need to embrace adaptation and deal with extreme weather events. But the third leg of the stool is carbon capture and sequestration. We've actually got to get the carbon out of the air. And I think we need the equivalent internationally of a Manhattan Project to figure out how to do this practically, cost-effectively, en masse. So there's three legs to the stool, and if any one of those legs collapses, the whole system comes down.
So Blair, when we have this conversation about heat waves and climate change, there is still a portion of the population that does not believe in climate change. What is the message to that population when we're trying to tackle heat waves, floods, and everything else that's coming our way?
Well, for people who simply don't accept the fact that climate change has happened, that it's real, they nonetheless can see the floods, the fire, and the more extremes in temperature. So my sense is they should look at that and say, even if you don't believe climate change is the causal mechanism, we still have to prepare for these extremes in weather that are occurring, independent of what they may believe is the cause. So we certainly need that preparedness in place in reference to how people view these systems. And overall, what we need to do, by the way, is develop a strong sense of urgency on the need to act to alleviate risk associated with these factors. In my opinion, and for Canada right now, the one thing that's missing more than anything is a sense of appreciation of the need to act with urgency to alleviate the risk that's in the system now and the greater risk that's coming due to climate change. Even if people don't accept that climate change is real, that is the reality.
Rachel, Arpita, Blair, thank you so much for your insights. There's obviously a lot of work to be done on this front when we talk about climate change and heat wave, but thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
It's said that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And to tour the litany of pandemics, earthquakes, famines, and wars laid out in historian Niall Ferguson's new book, it seems that really has always been the central proposition for humanity. Niall Ferguson is, of course, Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and a Senior Faculty Fellow of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. His latest book is called Doom: The Politics of Catastrophe. That's quite some cover. And we're pleased to welcome Niall back to our program from London, UK. It is good to see you again. How are you managing these days?
It's great to be with you, Steve. I'm managing to avoid disaster, which is, as you just said, the key to making it through life as a human being.
Isn't that the truth? Well, all disasters, you tell us, are actually man-made political disasters. Let's start there. Why do you say so?
Well, I think most of us carry around in our heads a distinction between a natural disaster and a man-made disaster. So we think of a pandemic as a natural disaster, like a volcanic eruption or an earthquake or a flood. And we think of a war or a revolution or a financial crisis as a man-made disaster. And one of the points I try to make in Doom is that that's a false dichotomy. Let's just take the case of the pandemic that is not yet over, COVID-19. You could make the argument that if it originated in a laboratory in Wuhan, it's not a natural disaster. We still don't know whether that's where it originated. We still don't have enough evidence because the Chinese government doesn't want to release it. But even if it's a natural disaster in the sense that the virus evolved in the wild and not in a laboratory, the fact that millions of people died around the world tells us that there was a political dimension to the catastrophe even so. After all, hardly anyone died in Taiwan and more than 1 million people died in the United States. That wasn't because of some genetic difference between the people in Taiwan and the people in North America. It was because governments handled the pandemic much, much better in countries such as Taiwan and much worse in the United States. So even there, it's political. So I make the argument that this is a false dichotomy. All disasters, even a volcanic eruption, is a political disaster if you have built a city right at the foot of the volcano and even rebuilt it after the first eruption.
Now, you do take us in the book through a litany of disasters over the course of world history, and I guess we should figure out whether, in your judgment, we actually learn anything from having experienced these disasters over and over and over. What do you think?
Well, less than we should, I think, is the takeaway. Clearly, we understand a lot more about infectious disease than people in Europe in the mid-14th century when the bubonic and pneumonic plague struck. That was the Black Death, probably the most disastrous pandemic, maybe the biggest disaster of all in human history, probably killed somewhere around 1/3 of living human beings in the 1340s, insofar as we can work that out. Now, clearly, we are far more scientifically sophisticated than the medieval population of Europe, and yet, if one looks at the performance, especially of the Western world in the face of COVID-19, it wasn't especially impressive. And I looked at some pandemics over the last century and was struck by the fact that in many ways, the United States handled the pandemic of 1957-58, the so-called Asian flu a great deal more competently than it handled COVID-19. Of course, they're not identical diseases, but there were respiratory diseases that spread around the world with comparable speed. And my sense is that one of the important points I'm making in Doom is that we actually don't perform as well as our scientific knowledge would lead one to expect. Just to illustrate the point further, at the end of 2019, the United States was ranked #1 in the world for pandemic preparedness. It was the country that was supposed to be best set up to cope with a global public health emergency. And the United Kingdom, where I'm speaking from, was #2. And both those countries performed really very badly compared with those expectations. So one has to ask the question why that was, given the kind of capacities that governments have today, as well as the scientific knowledge. We really ought to have handled this a good deal better than we did.
Well, you actually have anticipated my next question, because I hold in my hand here the sum total of all knowledge in the history of the world. It's amazing. It fits right into my hand. And yet, as you tell us, we are not yet very good at predicting when these things are going to happen. And we seem to be, appallingly unprepared for them when they do happen. How can that be?
Well, part of the reason is that it's just impossible to predict the timing and scale of most disasters. And that's a really important point. We would love prophets who could come along and say there's going to be a pandemic and it's going to start in January 2020 and it'll be pretty big with the potential to kill millions of people. But unfortunately, it's very hard to do that. In fact, it's impossible to do that because history tells us that the timing and scale of disasters such as pandemics are in fact highly unpredictable. They don't follow any normal distribution. There isn't an average pandemic. It's like hurricanes where there's some kind of seasonal predictability. The problem is that pandemics appear to follow what's known as a power law, and so do earthquakes and so do wildfires. And so they're extremely hard, indeed impossible, to predict with any accuracy. And wars are the same. There isn't really any kind of pattern to the incidence of war because wars seem to be pretty randomly distributed. There's no trend, with all due respect to that great Canadian Steve Pinker, towards an ever more peaceful world. If there was, the world wars wouldn't have happened in the last century. That would have happened far, far longer ago. So this is part of the reason that all that knowledge doesn't really get us to know when the next pandemic will strike or the next war will break out. But I think there's another problem, and that is that we've got a kind of fake preparedness in our time. And that's the fake preparedness that bureaucracies are very good at producing. There were any number of pandemic preparedness plans generated by government departments around the world in the prelude to 2020. The United States had one that came out in 2018. It was 36 pages long, and it made it seem as if the US was ready. But in reality, that plan disintegrated on contact with an actual pandemic. So I think part of what we're getting at here is that we just don't really have true preparedness. We have phony preparedness. And we have a whole range of agencies whose job it is to handle a pandemic who turn out to be less good at doing it than they were back in the 1950s. And that takes a little bit of explanation. And that goes to the heart of what's wrong with modern bureaucracy. It's a bigger bureaucracy, the public health bureaucracy in the US, than it was in the 1950s. But precisely its size has created, I think, a kind of sclerosis, so that, just to illustrate the point, when this pandemic began, and it was clearly happening early in 2020, some governments, the Taiwanese or the South Korean government, for example, very quickly ramped up testing capabilities so that they could find out who was infected. The United States Centers for Disease Control completely failed to do that, and indeed spent months actually making it harder to produce tests for COVID. And I think that illustrates a very important point, which is that in the face of a disaster, it's often that kind of mid-level bureaucratic failure that is the real problem.
Well, let's probe that a little deeper, because one could argue that these agencies are tasked to handle these responsibilities But if they're inappropriately funded by the political decision makers, or if they offer advice to politicians and that advice is not taken, is it a little tough to blame them? There certainly has been a tendency, it seems to me, over the last few years to put the blame at the doorstep of the Prime Minister or the President or the Governor or the Premier of whatever province. Who deservedly should get the blame?
Well, Harry Truman famously said the buck stops here. If you're the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of Canada or Great Britain, you have ultimate responsibility. But I don't think we should infer from that that decisions about how to deal with a public health emergency should be taken by the President or the Prime Minister. In reality, it's the public health bureaucracy that has to determine if there is a significant risk of a pandemic, and then to make recommendations. That prime ministers and presidents aren't emperors making all the decisions. By and large, if one actually looks at the decision-making processes in early 2020, the people who were nominally running governments were being buffeted by expert advice, which was sometimes conflicting. And I think it's clear that if you have an Undersecretary for Preparedness at the Department of Health and Human Services, which the United States did and does, that person bears a really significant responsibility for making sure that there's a good pandemic preparedness plan and that he knows or she knows when to execute it. In reality, the person who occupied that position in 2020 had admitted in 2018 that the pandemic preparedness plan wasn't really worth the paper it was printed on. And so I think that illustrates an important point, which is not just true of COVID, it's true of many other disasters, that very often the agency whose one job it is actually not fit for purpose and comes up with fake plans, fake preparedness plans. You could trace this problem back into other kinds of disaster. One of the arguments I make in the book is there's kind of a pattern which we can begin to see over 20 or so years. Prior to 9/11, there were people whose job it was to think about the possibility of a terrorist attack on the United States. And yet it proved extremely difficult to convince anybody in the US government to take seriously the threats that Al-Qaeda was posing. And 9/11 therefore happened. Or think about the experts whose one job it was to regulate the banking system in 2007, 2008. The banking system in the United States was actually subject to all kinds of regulators. It wasn't like it was a deregulated sector of the economy like, say, Silicon Valley. And yet those regulators failed completely to see that a huge financial crisis was brewing. So an important point that Doom is trying to make is that we have a kind of semblance of preparedness for disaster. We have people whose job it is, and yet time and again, they don't deliver. And I think we have to ask a question, which is, why is that? And we have to stop blaming things in a very facile way on whoever happens to be president or, for that matter, prime minister at the time. It's gratifying. Journalists enjoy it, and often voters enjoy it. It was very gratifying for many people in 2020 to say that the excess mortality in the United States due to COVID was all the fault of Donald Trump, because they already hated Donald Trump and he was the perfect fall guy. And yet, when we look at what happened in 2021 after he'd gone, there were even more deaths from COVID. And that was at a time when vaccines were available. So I think it's clear that, as I argued in the book, it was an extraordinary oversimplification to lay all the blame for COVID and Trump. He made many mistakes, but I don't think it's right to say that the excess mortality was primarily due to those mistakes.
Okay, I take your point. Let's try another disaster here. Let's talk nuclear. Let's talk Chernobyl, one of the worst disasters in the nuclear industry ever. We like to think in democratic societies that something like Chernobyl, aside from design problems, we're talking human error here on the job at the moment, we'd like to think that couldn't happen in a democratic society, that part of the reason that happened was because of the sclerotic nature of an authoritarian or communist state. You looked into this. What do you think?
Well, the difference between what happened at Chernobyl and what happened at 3 Mile Island wasn't that great. And you could certainly argue that a certain amount of luck made sure that the US didn't have its own Chernobyl. The counter-argument would be, no, the reason that it didn't happen was that the standards of safety were higher in the United States. And I'm inclined to acknowledge that they were higher, because when you look at the Chernobyl disaster, there were a bunch of things, precautions not taken in the construction of the key reactor, which were taken where comparable reactors were built at around the same time. The trouble is, then you think of Fukushima, and it's pretty clear that Japan is not a communist state, it's a liberal democracy, and yet Fukushima was one of those disasters that a number of experts had foreseen, particularly because of the insufficient protection of reactors from a tsunami danger. So I don't think one can make the claim that it's only authoritarian regimes that produce these types of disaster. The truth, though, is that the worst disasters of the 20th century, the really extraordinarily costly disasters in terms of human life, the famines, for example, in the Soviet Union in the 30s or China in the 1950s, were caused by totalitarian regimes. And so I think a key point to make is that if one's asking what were the big disasters, in the 20th century, totalitarian regimes had a pretty big hand in some of the worst ones. You can't claim that democracy is a guaranteed protection against disaster, though. That argument has sometimes been made. The great Harvard economist Amartya Sen has argued that famines can't happen in democratic states, and there does seem to be some truth to that claim. But when you look at other disasters, well, we've just been talking about a pandemic, but you could also talk about wildfires, you could talk about a whole range of different disasters. They do seem to happen in democracies. And of course, democracies can get themselves into disastrous wars pretty much as readily as dictatorships. So it's not as simple politically as it might at first appear.
You remind us, I guess I should say, for younger viewers, or perhaps for those who aren't as up on history as you are, they may think COVID is the worst thing that's ever happened in the history of the world. And here's you reminding us in your book that that's not the case by a long shot. Sheldon, if you would, this graphic, please. We may say that there have probably been, in all of recorded history, 7 major pandemics with victims greater than 1% of the estimated world population, of which 4 killed more than 3%, and 2, the plague of Justinian and the Black Death, more than 30%. Do you want to just take us through a bit of human history and remind people that we've done a lot worse than this in previous generations?
Well, yes, we have, Steve. It's only relatively recently that the COVID death toll got this pandemic into the top 20 in history. It overtook the 1957-58 Asian flu some time ago, but it still hasn't caught up with the 1918-19 Spanish influenza. In fact, it's somewhere in the same range as the 1889 so-called Russian influenza, which some people think was actually caused by a coronavirus. Nobody now remembers the 1889 Russian flu pandemic. So I think that illustrates that while it has seemed to us a great disaster, from the vantage point of history, it's medium-sized at best. And remember, unlike most pandemics in history, COVID-19 disproportionately killed the elderly and left the very young more or less unscathed, not wholly unscathed, but relatively unscathed. And that's unusual. 1918-19 was notable because it killed a great many people in the prime of life. In fact, it began at a US Army base and swept through the armies of the combatant powers in the latter stages of World War I. And then it spread globally throughout the world, and it killed people in their 20s as well as in their teens. In ways that we can scarcely imagine. I think everybody should recognize that this pandemic would have been almost unbearably worse, psychologically as well as in terms of mortality, if it had been killing the very young at the same rate that it killed the very old. You try and compare our experience with something as cataclysmic as the Black Death of the 1340s, it's almost impossible to conceive of just how horrific that was. They had, after all, no medical protection against it. They had no understanding, in fact, of what was spreading the bubonic plague. The fact that it was fleas on rats that were the culprit was largely not understood. And so they had horrific levels of mortality, maybe 1 in 3 on average, and no real understanding of what was happening. Hence the resort to religious attempts to ward off further waves of plague. This was the age of the flagellant orders. People would wander from town to town in medieval Europe, whipping themselves, atoning for their sins, as they thought, in the hope of warding off further divine wrath. So I'm not diminishing in any way the suffering that there has been as a result of the COVID pandemic. It's been horrific, and a great many families have lost loved ones. That's unquestionably true. But from the historian's vantage point, the really striking thing is that this is not one of history's really big pandemics, and we got off comparatively lightly, hard though that may be to believe.
Mm-hmm. We've got about 4 minutes to go here, and I want to put a different kind of disaster to you, and that is the disaster that is the war in Ukraine today. And I'm interested, from your historical perch, about the kind of language that the leaders are using. They are really drawing upon previous wars throughout history to make their points today. Can you touch on how that is animating the arguments made by both sides here?
Well, only the other day, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky used a historical analogy to criticize, of all people, Henry Kissinger, arguing that Kissinger's speech at the Davos World Economic Forum, in which he made an argument for peace on the basis of the status quo ante, i.e. the situation before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was appeasement. And he threw out the date 1938, which is notorious historically because of the Munich Conference, which effectively partitioned Czechoslovakia. I don't think that's an appropriate analogy at all, but I think it's a good example of the ways in which people use history, often to raise the temperature of debate. Clearly, Russia's aggression is part of a grand design by Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, to rebuild the Russian Empire. It's been long in the making. This is not his first invasion of Ukraine. It's not his first invasion. He invaded Ukraine first in 2014. The question is, what is the end game? That was the question that I think Kissinger rightly asked at Davos. The United States and its allies in NATO have supplied the Ukrainians with the weaponry not to lose the war, but it's not clear that they can supply them with enough weaponry to win the war. And we're seeing something that looks increasingly like a stalemate developing in the conflict as the Russians gain control of larger and larger parts of the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. This is a very disastrous war, Steve, in terms of mortality. The casualties are extremely high on both sides. It's one of the most destructive wars that the world has seen since the Iran-Iraq war that followed the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And perhaps that's the thing that will bring about a ceasefire maybe later this year, the sheer exhaustion that both armies are going to suffer from through very high casualties. But it is a disaster not only in human terms, but in economic terms that will reverberate around the world because of the importance of Russia and Ukraine for global wheat exports. And I'm afraid to say that fresh disasters are almost certainly approaching in the form of famine in those parts of Africa that cannot get sufficient food as a result of the conflict in Ukraine. In that sense, unfortunately, one disaster often leads to another in a kind of cascade or avalanche. And that is why I wrote the book, even though, as people said, the pandemic's not over, you should wait. My attitude is we can't wait to understand the nature of disaster because history is, to a very large extent, one disaster after another, and you don't know what the next one's likely to be.
Well, do you think it's an appropriate or inappropriate look back at history when we read headlines in newspapers that say, is Putin the new Hitler? Or are we on the verge of a new American Civil War? That kind of thing.
Well, my sense is that historical analogies are actually essential for our understanding of the contemporary world, but we've got to be not so slapdash about those analogies. I don't think, for example, that what Putin is doing resembles what Hitler did, because Hitler conquered the whole European continent before he was finally and with great difficulty defeated Putin has struggled to take control of even part of Ukraine, and he certainly couldn't fight a war, a conventional war, with the whole of NATO. So I don't think that's a helpful analogy. I think it's clear from Putin's own statements that his fantasy is not to be Hitler or, for that matter, Stalin, but to be Peter the Great. As for the American Civil War, people forget when they talk in these terms, having spent too long on Twitter, that for a civil war to happen, the armed forces of a country have to divide. There has to be trained military on both sides, as there was, of course, in the American Civil War. And I don't think there's the remotest chance of that happening in the United States today. So that analogy seems to me to be overdone and to exaggerate the extent of the polarization of American society.
And in our last minute, I want to put that Martin Luther King quote to you, which is that history follows an arc that ultimately bends towards justice. You have really cataloged a great deal of misery in the last couple of thousand years of our planet here. Do you think Martin Luther King was right?
Never disagree with Martin Luther King as a good rule, but I'm skeptical about the idea of an arc of history, because that's not how history looks to me. History looks like a much bumpier ride. It often takes us backwards as well as forwards. There are some underlying trends which we shouldn't ignore, the great technological and scientific advances of the relatively recent past and the economic benefits that those have brought. That has definitely transformed life for most people on this planet. But even with that progress that we've made since around the 1800s and the dramatic progress that we've seen in the last 50 years around the world, we're still disaster prone. And actually, the more globalized we've become as a species, the more integrated we've become economically, the more vulnerable we've become to disaster. So the arc of history may well exist, but it's broken and jagged and a pretty bumpy ride, as most of us have been learning with considerable discomfort over the last 2.5 years.
We always like it when Niall Ferguson takes our calls because his books are always so thought-provoking. His latest is called Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, and we're delighted that it's allowed you to join us from London, UK on TVO tonight. Niall, be well and thanks again.
Thanks so much, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Thursday, June 30th, 2022. Tomorrow is, of course, Canada Day. And while for some people that's not a cause for unambiguous celebration, we'll find out how it can be a source of renewal and recognition for all. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
TVO.org has a brand new look online. For the latest Ontario current affairs from our digital team, from The Agenda, of course, and for all of our podcast documentaries and programs, check out the slick new website at tvo.org.